Imagine for a second that it is 1946. The war is finally over. The soldiers are coming home, and for the first time in a generation, there is a sense of genuine relief. This was the beginning of what people called the Golden Age of America. It was a time of massive growth. You could see it in the new highways being built and the suburbs spreading out across the landscape. For the children born into this moment, the American dream was not just an idea, it was something they could see and touch. It was made of concrete and new houses and the sound of factories humming with energy. But here's the thing. When you grow up in that kind of environment, it does something to your perspective. If you were a child in the 1950s, your world was defined by certainty. You lived in neighborhoods with tree-lined streets where you could leave your bike on the grass and never worry about it. There was a rhythm to life. Dinner happened at the exact same time every night. You walked to school because your parents actually believed the world was safe. The rules were very simple back then. You were told to listen to adults, do your homework, and be home before the streetlights came on. This created a specific kind of mental structure. It taught a whole generation that the world had a logic to it. If you followed the rules, things would turn out okay. And that structure was even stronger inside the home. Most families had a very clear authority.
Have a good day.
Usually you had a
Bye,
mother who
dear.
stayed home and a father who went to work. Discipline was not a negotiation. It was direct. Children were expected to adapt to the reality that adults
you
were in
can do
charge.
it.
Yes.
You did not argue about your bedtime or your chores. You learned very early on that there was a hierarchy, and you were at the bottom of it. But here is what is interesting. That trust and authority did not stop at the front door. It extended to every part of society. People truly believed in American institutions. They trusted their schools, their churches, and the government. Even the major corporations were seen as reliable. Think about someone like Walter Cronkite. When he told people what was happening in the news, they believed him. There was a sense that the country was stable and powerful. It felt morally certain, and a big part of that certainty came from a single piece of furniture: the television. Back then, families did not have their own individual screens. They gathered around one TV set in the living room. Everyone watched the same shows. They saw the same commercials and listened to the same news reports.
Breaking news has just come in.
When a massive event happened, like the moon landing in 1969, the entire country watched it together. It created a shared reality. You knew that your neighbor was seeing the exact same thing you were. It was a cohesive national identity because all the information was coming from the same place. But then, the world started to change. And it happened with a series of shocks. The assassination of JFK in 1963 was like a physical blow to that national innocence. Suddenly, the world did not feel quite so safe anymore.
Tonight, the conflict continues in Southeast Asia.
Then you had the Vietnam War playing out on the nightly news, right there in the living room. You had civil rights protests that forced the country to look at itself and confront its own failures. For the first time, this generation was watching authority being questioned on a massive scale. It was a psychological shock to go from the quiet stability of the 1950s to the chaos of the late 1960s. Yet, even with all that social change, the American formula still seemed to hold up for a long time. The truth is, for a boomer, work was a responsibility, not a way to find your identity. In the late 1960s and 1970s, you did not go to a job to express your soul. You went to a factory or an office to do what needed to be done. Work was the way you supported your family. It was a duty. And the path was very straightforward. You would graduate high school, maybe go to college, get a stable job, buy a house, and raise your kids. Then, at the end of it all, you would retire with a pension. This formula actually worked for a lot of people back then. It reinforced the belief that if you were patient and put in the effort, you would be rewarded. It made sense. That is why their sense of self is so tied to their roles. If you ask someone from this generation who they are, they might talk about being a provider, a supervisor, or a homeowner. They earned their identity through those responsibilities. For them, success was about stability, not about being visible or going viral. This also explains why they have such a deep respect for seniority. In their world, age actually mattered because it represented experience. You were expected to wait your turn. Authority was something you earned over a long period of time. You did not expect to be in charge on your first day because you understood the value of putting in the years. But we also have to remember how different life was before the internet. Before everything was digital, mistakes were private. If you messed up or had a bad argument, it happened face to face. There was no permanent record of your worst moments. There were no screenshots or viral videos to haunt you for the rest of your life. Your reputation could actually recover. There was a level of privacy that we have almost entirely lost today, and because they lived in a physical world, they learned how to fix things. If the car broke down or the radio stopped working, you did not just throw it away and buy a new one. You learned how to repair it. Ownership meant taking responsibility for the things you had. You wanted things to last. When they became parents in the 1970s and 1980s, they wanted to pass these values down. They pushed their kids toward education and hard work. They genuinely wanted the next generation to have even more than they did. But here is where the ground started to move. In the 1980s and 1990s, the cracks began to appear. Manufacturing started to decline. Those pensions that were promised began to disappear. Layoffs, which used to be rare, became a common part of life. Suddenly, the loyalty people had shown to their companies was no longer being rewarded. Then the 2000s arrived and technology accelerated everything. The internet changed the way the world worked. Suddenly, experience mattered less than adaptability. The systems that had worked for 40 years were no longer delivering the same results. Retirement started to feel less secure. Authority was being questioned constantly, and the world was moving faster than ever before. Many boomers felt the ground shift under their feet. It is easy to look at them now and think they are just out of touch. But the truth is, they are shaped by a time when America worked differently. The emotional core of this generation is built on the idea that effort should be rewarded. They believe that rules should be consistent and that stability should exist. Can those things fail? It does not just feel like a political problem to them. It feels personal. It feels like the world broke a promise that they spent their whole lives believing in. Understanding them is not about agreeing with every perspective they have. It is about understanding the world they grew up trusting. It was a world of clear lines and shared stories. It was a world where you believed that if you did your part, the system would do its part too. Maybe the reason there is so much tension today is because we are living in a world that does not have those clear lines anymore. For someone who was raised with them, that is a very difficult thing to let go of. It really makes you wonder, what parts of our world today will we be holding onto in 40 years, even if the rules have completely changed again? It is something to think about.